This is for Palestine, Ramallah, West Bank, Gaza. This is for the child that is searching for an answer. This is not just a war over stolen land. Why do you think little boys are throwing stones at tanks? And we'll never really know how many people are dead. They drop bombs on innocent girls while they sleep in their bed. Israel is a terror state, they're terrorists that terrorize. I'll testify my television, televise them telling lies. How many more resolutions have to be violated? How many more children have to be annihilated? This is not a war, it is systematic genocide. But whatever they try, Palestine will never die. Free, free Palestine! Free, free Palestine! Free, free Palestine! Free, free Palestine!
Hello, I'm Chris Williamson and you're watching Palestine Declassified. We're the only weekly TV show focusing on investigating and exposing the Israeli regime's global war against solidarity with the illegally occupied people of Palestine. In this Christmas edition of the show, we'll be asking where Jesus would stand as Palestinian resistance factions continue to push back against Israel's barbaric occupation forces in the birthplace of Christianity. Of course, Jesus was a Palestinian revolutionary who challenged vested interest, including the Imperial Roman Empire, as Latifa Abu Chakra will explain.
Western ideas about Jesus and his role sometimes forget his origins. Yes, Jesus was a Jewish rabbi, and yes, he was Palestinian. As Hamid Dabashi has noted, generations of European depiction of Christ as a blonde-haired, blue-eyed white man have made it difficult for European and North American Christians today to imagine him for what he was, a Jewish Palestinian refugee child who grew up to become a towering revolutionary figure. The writer Terry Eagleton notes, Jesus was homeless, vagrant, without property, celibate, a scourge of the rich and powerful, a champion of the dispossessed, and averse to material goods. Eagleton goes on to say that Jesus warned his followers that if they speak out for justice and friendship as he did, then they too will be done away with by the state. There are plenty of Latter-day Zealots who have learnt this lesson the hard way. Jesus was, as Reza Aslan puts it, a politically conscious revolutionary Jewish figure who 2,000 years ago walked across the Galilean countryside, gathering followers for a messianic movement with the goal of establishing the kingdom of God, but whose mission failed when, after a provocative entry into Jerusalem and a brazen attack on the temple, he was arrested and executed by Rome for the crime of sedition. It is important to remember that Jesus is a figure of immense importance to Jews, Christians, and Muslims. He is a prophet in the Torah, the Bible, and indeed the Quran. In the Quran, Jesus, or Isa in Arabic, is referred to in about 71 verses. Today, the descendants and disciples of Jesus in Palestine, whether Jewish, Christian, or Muslim, are engaged in a life or death struggle to cast off the genocidal ideology of Zionism. The Zionists, for their part, have shown a particular desire to destroy all of the infrastructure that sustains Palestinian society. Hospitals, schools, universities, and places of worship and prayer, especially those run by Muslims and Christians. It's this, in addition to the deliberate targeting of journalists, doctors, aid workers, and other civilians, as well as babies and children, that marks this out as a genocide of truly biblical proportions. The question at Christmas this year for all those Jews, Christians, or Muslims who believe in Jesus as a prophet, as well as for the unbelievers, is would Jesus have been a leader of the Palestinian resistance?
As always, we're joined by our resident expert, David Miller. David's an academic and a former professor at Bristol University and is now a non-resident senior research fellow at the Centre for Islam and Global Affairs at Istanbul Zeyim University. He's also a co-director of the lobbying watchdog Spinwatch and is a leading British scholarly critic of Israel. Our guest today is the Reverend Dr. Stephen Sizer. Stephen is a long-standing human rights campaigner and an outspoken supporter of the Palestinian people. He's been targeted by the Israel lobby, who've waged a vicious and vituperative campaign against him over many years. But in spite of the slings and arrows, Stephen continues to speak out for justice for Palestine. He's a member of various pro-Palestinian groups and the founder and director of the Peacemaker Trust. He's also written several books, including In the Footsteps of Jesus and the Apostles, Christian Zionism, Roadmap to Armageddon, and Zion's Christian Soldiers. Welcome to the show. Stephen, start with you. What's your views on Jesus' politics then?
Well, Jesus laid out his manifesto, if you like, in his very first sermon. He quotes the prophet Isaiah, and he says, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me. He's appointed me to bring good news to the poor, recovery of sight to the blind, to set the oppressed free and announce the year of the Lord's favour. He's talking about Jubilee. It happened every 50 years when debts were cancelled, slaves were freed, and any property that had been sold or loaned had to be given back to the original family. So he was challenging the excessive wealth and poverty and the segregation in society. He was calling for liberty, equality, fraternity, calling people back to a right relationship with God and with one another. And although we have yet to experience heaven on earth, there's a foretaste of that in the way that we seek to follow Jesus and follow his example, and the way we treat one another.
Yeah. So in the time of Jesus then, David, I mean, was Palestine a Jewish state?
No. I mean, the way in which the Zionists present it is that there was a Jewish state there, and then the Jews were all kicked out, and they've always wanted to come back, and that's what Israel is. But of course, it's not true. I mean, there were parts of what's now Palestine which were Jewish and which were run as effectively as something like a Jewish state, or there was no such thing as states in that period. Yeah. But for example, I mean, the whole area of Judea and Samaria is what the Zionists call the West Bank. But Judea was Jewish, but Samaria wasn't. So the whole thing is rested on this historical myth that there's this Jewish state, and all they're doing is re-establishing something which was historically there. It wasn't. It's completely wrong.
Mm. So, Stephen, I mean, why were the statements and the political statements that Jesus made so controversial, do you think?
He was controversial because he undermined the status quo, the hierarchical structure of society, and he spoke about power in a very unique way. He challenged three groups of people particularly: the zealots who were into violent resistance. He challenged the majority of people who passive acquiescence, who gave way and gave in, and he challenged the collaborators. That was Herod and the Pharisees, or the Palestinian Authority today, and Western governments acquiesced to Israel. Jesus was different. He didn't challenge the Roman Empire full on, and instead he undermined it by placing God above everyone and calling people back to a right relationship with God. He undermined it by challenging the religious leaders who were accommodating to the occupation, and gave a vision of what the world could be like. He broke down the barriers, and that was a great threat to the established status quo. Christians believe that he ultimately gave his life as a sacrifice to save the world, and he calls us to be his peacemakers, agents of that reconciliation work.
David, do you think then in the modern world that there's a greater recognition that Jesus was actually a Palestinian, not a blonde-haired Caucasian, as is often portrayed?
There is much more recognition of that now. I mean, I think when you and I were growing up many years ago, there wasn't such a recognition: blonde, blue-haired, blue-eyed, blonde-haired, etc. But since then, of course, partly science has moved on, and partly the understanding of the way in which the world operates, and in particular the way in which colonialism operates, has moved on, which means that there's a greater recognition, even amongst formerly power centres which formerly were related to colonialism in some way, that Jesus was not a white person. He was a Palestinian, and he came from West Asia and didn't descend from the Europeans. So that was a revelation, would have been a revelation 30 years ago, but is no longer such a revelation. But it's quite interesting, though, to remember in the current circumstances that he wasn't just someone who came from a Jewish state. He was a Palestinian, and that's the key thing, given everything that's happening in Gaza just now.
Stephen, tell us about your take then on Christ throwing the money changers and the merchants out of the temple.
Well, Orthodox Jews regard Jesus as a charlatan. Our Muslim brothers and sisters regard him as a prophet. Christians see him as the Son of God.
Yeah.
But most people in our secular society have no idea who he is. Maybe a good man, a great moral teacher. gentle Jesus, meek and mild. But when you read the Gospels, you see a very different view of Jesus. Unleashed, untamed, unpredictable, militant. Jesus mean and wild.
Yeah.
And you see this particularly in the story of the turning out the money changers and
Yes.
the people selling animals in the temple.
Yeah.
The temple was meant to be a place of prayer for all nations, but the religious leaders had turned it into a market. They fleeced pilgrims two ways. They insisted they had a temple tax they had to pay, but it had to be a special coin, so the exchange rates were exorbitant. And then you'd bring your animal to sacrifice, and they say, "I'm sorry, that's impure. You're going to have one of our animals."
Right.
So they fleeced them twice.
Sure.
So Jesus got a cord, and he physically forced them out.
Yeah.
And when they said, "What are you doing?" he said, "My house shall be a house of prayer for all nations."
Yeah.
If that's how Jesus treated people who made it hard for Gentiles to worship in the temple, you can imagine what he thinks today.
Indeed.
of Zionists who've been bombing churches,
Absolutely.
places of worship, and killing pilgrims and refugees who've gone there for safety.
We'll touch on that a little later in the show. But David, then, based on what Stephen's saying there, do you think if Jesus were around today that he'd be with the resistance?
I would say that really when we talk about the resistance, we're not just when we talk about Hamas.
Yeah.
Hamas is, of course, the government of Gaza. And so there is, of course, the military wing, the Qassam brigades of Hamas, just like there's the military wing of the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, the Al-Quds brigades. And those are engaged in armed struggle and armed resistance, certainly. But all of the rest of Hamas is engaged in civil resistance. It runs the hospitals, it sort of runs the educational facilities. Now, Jesus would have been in that resistance. Whether he would have been in the armed wing or not, I think we can debate, but he certainly would have been part of the resistance to occupation.
Well, we'll come back to the discussion in a moment, because I just want to hear your thoughts on our next video about the Zionist entity's all-out assault on Gaza's Christian community.
Christians and Christianity are under attack in Gaza and Palestine more generally. Zionist ideology is not just anti-Muslim, it is anti-Christian too. What is the common factor that links Muslims and Christians in Palestine? They're Palestinian. So it's no surprise that the Zionists are making sure to destroy churches as well as mosques. On October the 19th, Israel bombed the Church of St. Porphyrius, Gaza's oldest, killing at least 18 people. The church is said to be the third oldest Christian church in the world, with the current building having been constructed by the Crusaders in the 1150s or 1160s. A church was built on the site as early as 425 AD. 2 days earlier, an explosion at Al-Ahli Arab Hospital, an Anglican institution located a few blocks away, killed and injured hundreds, according to Palestinian health authorities. The evidence is beginning to mount that the attacks on specifically Christian targets are themselves a specific genocide, contained within the larger genocide aimed at Muslims and indeed all Palestinians. On December 16th, the Zionists directly targeted a Christian convent. An Israeli army sniper assassinated 2 Christian women, Nahed and her daughter Samar, inside the parish of the Holy Family in Gaza on Saturday, said the Latin Patriarchate's media office. One of the women fell while trying to rescue the other. 7 others were injured while attempting to help. Gunfire was directed at them inside the walls of the monastery, and there was no resistance in the area, it added. An Israeli artillery vehicle also targeted the Monastery of the Sisters of Mother Teresa in Gaza City, which shelters more than 54 disabled individuals within the church walls. The Zionist attack also destroyed the fuel tank, the power generator, and the solar panels, in addition to extensive damage that rendered the place unsuitable for habitation or providing care for people with disabilities. On January the 26th this year, a mob of Israeli settlers attacked an Armenian bar in the Christian quarter of the old city of Jerusalem, shouting "Death to Arabs, death to Christians." At the beginning of October, a video emerged of ultra-Orthodox settlers in Al-Quds spitting on Christian pilgrims. Armed and violent settlers are also in the process of attempting to liquidate the Armenian quarter in Al-Quds, and with it the wider Christian presence which has been there continuously since the 4th century. Only 800 to 1,000 Christians are believed to still live in Gaza, constituting the oldest Christian community in the world, dating back to the 1st century.
This year, Christmas celebrations are cancelled in Bethlehem, and for obvious reasons. It's impossible to celebrate while our people in Gaza are going through a genocide.
It's no wonder the church in Palestine has cancelled Christmas.
David, would you agree that there's a sort of generalised anti-Christian bias in Zionism?
Well, there certainly is. And of course, the thing is that it's not just that they're anti-Muslim and not just that they're anti-Christian. The reason that they're both of those things is that they're anti-Palestinian. And of course, Palestinians are mostly Muslim, but there are many Christian Palestinians, which I think a lot of people in the West don't really fully appreciate. And people know, I suppose, abstractly that Christianity comes from Palestine, from Bethlehem and Jerusalem and the like, but they don't really, I think, understand that actually many of today's Palestinians are Christians, and including many who've been involved in the resistance movements, not just Muslims who get involved in resistance movements, also Christians in Palestine.
Yeah. I mean, Stephen, in your opinion, do you think that the Zionist onslaught against Palestinian Christians actually constitutes a genocide?
Very much so, very much so. The Christian Palestinian community is problematic to Zionists because they want to portray this as an eternal war between Muslims and Jews, and they depend heavily on Western Christian support. And so the presence of an indigenous Palestinian Christian community is problematic. So it's not surprising, perhaps, that they've been targeting churches, hospitals, schools of the remnant of Christians still in Gaza. I mean, it's ironic that I've been criticised for comparing Netanyahu with Herod, who killed the little boys in Bethlehem. But looking at statistically, he probably killed 20 to 30 little children in Bethlehem 2,000 years ago. Israel's killed thousands of children, Muslim and Christian children in Gaza today. So it's clearly genocide.
Yes, yes. Well, David, I mean, it seems to me that these attacks on Christian churches in Gaza, I mean, suggest that it's not just the settler extremist fringe that's anti-Christian. I mean, what do you think?
So we saw in the film there some examples of the ways in which some of the ultra-Orthodox and some of the extremist settlers target Christianity, specifically for being Christian. Yeah. And you can make the argument, I guess, that, well, it's just the extremists. But actually, what we've seen in the last few months in Gaza is that there is no distinction between the extremists and those who are in charge and directing the IDF, the Israel Occupation Forces, the intelligence services, and the government of Israel. So there's no distinction. But what you see is the direct attempt to simply eliminate all signs of Christianity from Gaza by the direct targeting of the churches, just like they've been doing with the mosques in terms of targeting Muslims. So it's an attempt to wipe out a civilization. In fact, to eliminate Christians altogether from Gaza, and that, as Stephen says, is plainly genocide. But it's a deliberate thing which is done by the people who are in charge of the Zionist entity.
And we saw, didn't we, Stephen, in the video just there, two Palestinian Christian women who were shot dead by the Zionist forces. Would you say that's unusual in war, to see civilians targeted in that way? They're seeking refuge?
Well, sadly, civilians are casualties in war, but this was premeditated. It was a sniper. It wasn't an indiscriminate killing. It's one of the criteria for war crimes charges. The Latin Patriarch in Jerusalem issued a statement following the murder of Nahida and her daughter Summer. Let me just read to you a short part of it. He said, a sniper of the IDF murdered 2 Christian women inside the Holy Family Parish in Gaza, where the majority of Christian families were taking refuge since the start of the war. Nahida and her daughter Summer were shot and killed as they walked to the sisters' convent. One was killed as she tried to carry the other to safety. 7 more people were shot and wounded as they tried to protect others in the church compound. No warning was given, no notification was provided. They were shot in cold blood inside the premises of the church. that's clearly a war crime.
Absolutely, and we just heard the deputy mayor of Jerusalem claiming that there are no churches there. I mean, what do you make of that?
Well, again, this is propaganda. They want to imply that this is a war between Muslims and Jews.
Yeah.
Christians and Muslim Palestinians have worked together. They're brothers and sisters. They're suffering together, and they're standing together.
And David, there seems to be an all-out assault on Christian communities in Jerusalem as well, isn't there? So, I mean, what do you know about that?
So we saw on the film there the spitting incident, which is quite a well-known thing, where ultra-Orthodox Jews spit on Christians, on the floor, on the priests, defended in fact by Ben Gvir, saying it's an old Jewish tradition, nothing to see here, don't worry about it. Now that, of course, in addition to the attacks and the desecration of Christian cemeteries in Jerusalem, it is part of the context for a land grab which is going on now. There are 4 parts of Jerusalem historically: the Muslim quarter, the Jewish quarter, the Christian quarter, and the Armenian quarter. And the Armenian quarter, of course, being also Christian. And there's an attempt by the settler movement to take control of the Armenian quarter and to settle it, Judaize it, have only Jewish people living there. They've tried to take 25% of it. So it's a deliberate attempt to ethnically cleanse one of the historic quarters of Jerusalem and to replace Christians with Jews.
And just say a word or two, David, as well, will you, about the pro-Zionist evangelical community in the United States? I mean, it seems to be a kind of conflict of opinion, really, there, in terms of, well, certainly a conflict of their attitude in terms of there being a kind of allegedly a religious community, and yet, supporting, it's quite unqualified support for this carnage that's going on.
Well, I mean, Stephen is the expert on this, but Christian Zionism is, of course, a mass phenomenon in the US, and of course, as people say, there are more Christian Zionists than there are Jewish Zionists in America, which is a pretty extraordinary thing. But of course, they are strongly in support of what's happening in Palestine, of the Zionist entity, and it's truly a disgrace. I mean, as I'm sure Stephen could tell you, the scriptures do not give warrant for that kind of approach, which is a racist approach.
Yeah, I mean, Stephen, I know that you've sort of clashed with the Christian Zionists, haven't you, over your career? I mean, what exactly is their kind of, are they sort of saying? How do they justify their positions in your experience?
Christian Zionism was an oxymoron. You can be a Christian, you can be a Zionist, but you can't be both. It's like saying I'm a Christian racist. Right. Christian Zionism was founded on the idea that the Jews are God's chosen people, ethnically pure, racially descended from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The promises God made to Abraham apply to the Jews today. They get all of the land between the river and the sea, between Iraq and Egypt. They get Jerusalem as their exclusive capital. And they're on God's side, and therefore if you don't stand with Israel, God's going to judge you. It's an apocalyptic theology. It's dangerous, and it needs to be repudiated.
And what would your message be to Christians, watching this horror unfold? Particularly as we run into Christmas. I mean, it's just horrific. I mean,
I would invite them to reflect upon how they're celebrating Christmas. In Bethlehem, at the Lutheran Church, they have created a nativity scene, which is a pile of rocks, and on top of the rocks is a baby Jesus wrapped in a kafir, the Palestinian headscarf, and it's meant to represent Gaza. It's meant to represent the fact that as Munther Isaac, the pastor, says, if Jesus was born today, he'd be born under the rubble in Gaza. And, it's a shocking image, but it's the reality for many people in Gaza today. If I'm speaking to Christians about how to respond when we may feel helpless, when we may feel there's nothing we can do, I like to use a poem from an African-American theologian, Howard Thurman. He said this: "When the song of the angels is stilled, when the star in the sky is gone, when the kings and princes are home, when the shepherds are back with their flock, the work of Christmas begins. To find the lost, to heal the broken, to feed the hungry, release the prisoner, rebuild the nations, and bring peace among people, and make music in the heart."
Oh, very profound. Well, I'm afraid we're going to have to curtail our conversation on that very profound note there, as we're right out of time. I'd like to thank our guest, the Reverend Dr. Stephen Sizer, and of course our resident expert, Professor David Miller. I also want to say a big thank you to our viewers who've helped us to grow our audience over the last 12 months. So please keep on sharing the show, and don't forget you can also follow Palestine Declassified on Facebook, Twitter and Telegram, where we post regular clips and updates. In the meantime, have a lovely Christmas and we'll see you next week. Until then, this is Chris Williamson saying bye for now.